Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, a gas station attendant is terrorised by a serial killer ex-boyfriend. Or is she, in the horror film Open 24 Hours? Just released from prison, Mary, played by Vanessa Grasse, is still traumatised by her experiences with her ex-boyfriend James Lincoln Fields, the Rain Ripper, played by Cole Vignew, who she managed to escape by setting their house on fire. Mary gets a job working the night shift at a rural 24-hour gas station, but on her first night, Mary starts getting threatening calls and terrifying visions. Is James or someone else planning to take their revenge on Mary, or is it all in her mind? Open 24 Hours is the third film from horror director Patrick Reynolds, whose previous credits include The Rites of Spring and Worry Dolls, and he's already used the time since this film has been completed to make another movie, Dark Light, which has actually been released before this one. That's because Open 24 Hours has spent 2 years sat on the shelf, and I can't quite fathom how. This was shot in Serbia, doubling for Mississippi, with a largely Canadian cast, and released by a studio that normally does Bollywood films. Maybe that last one accounts for why it all but vanished after premiering at film festivals, including Frightfest in 2018, to fairly lukewarm reviews. But now it belatedly arrives, and in the UK, it's part of the Frightfest Presents label. And normally, when a movie has this long of a stay on the shelf, there's usually a reason for it. Usually, it's quite bad and distributors don't want to touch it with a barge pole, but at least on the surface, Open 24 Hours doesn't seem all that bad. It has a fairly good premise, it's quite slickly produced. It's just not all that great either. The film starts out in a fairly intriguing way, in that you have this character that is trying to rebuild their life. Mary is broken out of the mother of all abusive relationships, and as such is still burdened by the grief and trauma of it all. She has a huge amount of survivor's guilt, not least of which because James made her complicit in his crimes. He forced her to watch him kill his victims, and so she has vivid, recurring flashbacks, and also she knows that she could have potentially stopped him earlier if she mustered up the strength to. And so, right from the outset, the movie is blurring the lines between what's real and what's not. And what it reminded me of, and that's probably a little bit of an unfair comparison because this film was technically made after this one, but the recent Invisible Man remake, which again dealt with someone breaking out of a very, very controlling, abusive relationship and not quite knowing whether something is actually happening or whether it's all happening in her head. The difference between the two movies, though, is that in the recent Invisible Man remake, it felt like it was a lot more sympathetic towards her PTSD, and also it played those same tricks on the audience. We were being gaslit alongside Elizabeth Moss's character there. In this film, the visions that the character of Mary suffers, we know right from the outset that they're not real. A lot of the time, they feel false, and it ends up feeling like a lot of the time, it's just being used for cheap jump scares. There's a lengthy sequence where she goes into the gas station's bathroom, and it suddenly goes into just this series of hallucinations and jumps, and it just feels really tired and rote, and it doesn't feel like it's particularly attached to anything. It just feels like these are there to add some scares into the first half of the movie. There's also the problem that while Vanessa Grasse is actually quite good in the role, the acting in general here is surprisingly solid for a horror movie. She's miscast, she's too young in this role, she looks like she's not really old enough to have that kind of long-term relationship and then a stint in prison afterwards. It just doesn't feel right. Again, it would have benefited from someone a little bit older in that part, at least to make it a little bit more convincing that she would have experienced all of these things. Not that Grasse doesn't give it her best try, but it's just a problem overall with the movie. And there's a number of things about this that really don't quite add up when you think about them, like Mary going to prison for burning her ex-boyfriend who was a well-known, prolific serial killer who was wanted by the police. Any lawyer worth their salt would have been able to knock that down to a self-defense charge, and she would have likely been seen as another victim in all this. Instead, it seems like most people in the community blame her, or at least hold her to some degree as accountable as the person who actually perpetrated the murders. Also, the movie is really over-reliant on Mary having her visions, to the point where it becomes a tired crutch that grows increasingly repetitive and also strains credibility. She's constantly having flashbacks and traumatic episodes, to the point where you really think that she should just go back to a psychiatric institute, because she's in no state to be walking out into the rest of the world, aside from popping pills every couple of hours. What Reynolds does have to be commended for is that he makes very good use of his single location environment for much of the running time. The gas station, while a little bit sinister, does still feel believable. It feels like somewhere that's a little bit run down and aged and a bit dirty in places, especially in the toilets, which are downright squalid, and it's got these halogen lights which bathe it in this sickly yellow-green cast, but it never feels excessive. It never turns it into a haunted house or something silly like that. Likewise, Reynolds also smartly gets us accustomed to the space. There are chunks of the running time where Mary wanders around and makes sure she knows where everything is, and because we know the geography of the store, that means you can mine that for suspense, and Reynolds does in a later sequence where one character is wandering around and you got another set of characters with a gun pointed at a door and neither know the other one's there, and that's fairly effective because Reynolds has done the groundwork for it. Unfortunately, the gas station is probably a little bit too believable, because the movie quickly falls into the mundane in the middle act. There really isn't all that much happening, apart from Mary standing around waiting for customers to come in. And yeah, that is a fairly accurate experience of working the graveyard shift as a job like that, but it's not terribly exciting. And it feels like Mary is just repeatedly setting up her backstory over and over again. The movie takes almost an hour before it really gets moving, and would have greatly benefited from a much tighter edit. The movie's about 100 minutes long, and it doesn't need to be. This is a film that needs to be a good 90, even 80 minutes or so, because at this length it feels desperately overstretched at times, and also the lack of pacing at certain moments hurts the film. This also makes the movie overly reliant on those jolts of horror to bring our interest back into the proceedings. There was a moment that genuinely caught me off guard because it was still fairly early on and quite brutal, but then the movie fails to pay that off for another 40 minutes, and it just dissipates that momentum, as it does with a lot of the horror elements, as we wait for it to get where it really wants to go. Also, these horror cutaways undermine the suspense the movie is trying to build. It's clear that there is someone after Mary. We're not quite sure who or for what reason, but there is obviously someone with malicious intent. And that really doesn't work when the movie is trying to play this psychological game, and it's really clear that it isn't just in her head unless she has the ability to teleport. The movie tries to be very tricksy and clever and throws a lot of twists at the audience to try and outfox them, but all it does is ultimately outwit itself. It ends up getting knotted in its own convoluted plotting. In order for things to happen this way, it requires extraordinary amounts of coincidences, if not outright plot holes. A good example of this happens around halfway through, where the movie tries to pull off a double bluff. It goes, "Ha! You thought it was that thing? It's actually this. Oh wait, no it isn't." I almost admire the film for the audacity of that moment, but that is preposterous, not least of which because it requires several characters with similar but different motivations to know where Mary is at this gas station job on her first day, I'd like to remind you, and also arrive at almost exactly the same time as each other. It just stretches the movie to breaking point, and from that point forward, it becomes very clear the movie has no interest in the psychological logical and just moves into straightforward slasher territory. Once it does that, the contrivances and lapses in logic just pile on from there, as you would expect. This has all the slasher movie tropes that horror fans have grown accustomed to, not least of which in that you have a killer that is essentially a ninja. He goes around, sneaks up on people, and appears and disappears seemingly at random, even though he's carrying around things like a big heavy sledgehammer at points. It really does become so very, very silly, and it really becomes a struggle to take anything from that point forward especially seriously. And even more so, there's moments where you just go, wait, what? Really? Especially towards the end of the film, where the character decides in their infinite wisdom, yes, I'm just going to go back to the place that I just escaped from. However, it is fairly clear that Reynolds is a fan of old school slasher movies in a way that horror fans may well enjoy, because it does feel like a throwback at times. The villain in The Rain Slicker especially is very I Know What You Did Last Summer. There's a twist in the movie that brings to mind the original Friday the 13th, but I'm not sure where these are homages or just make the film feel more derivative. Gorehounds in particular may well appreciate that this is no holds barred on that front. The violence, when it does arrive, is brutal and often quite protracted, which does make a little bit of a refreshing change considering that so many horror films feel anemic and ready for PG-13 these days, but it feels like it goes too far in the opposite direction. It reminded me of a lot of horror films that came out around the time of the torch porn craze of Saw and Hostel, and it feels like the violence is there for its own sake. This is especially true in the third act, where there is a lengthy extended scene where Mary is forced to watch the killer go to work, where he whammies on a guy's head with a sledgehammer repeatedly until his skull caves in. Good effects work, but that's not what I watch horror movies for. That's not scary, that's just gross. And it's unpleasant in a bad way. It's not enjoyable to watch scenes like that. It just adds an unpleasant taste to the movie. It's so silly in other elements, but it adds a sadism to the general tone of the film that it never really shrugs off, and it just makes me uncomfortable to have that kind of element in there. I should also mention the movie has two endings for no real reason. It's clearly had a more optimistic conclusion, and then someone said, you know what we should do? We should have a jump scare ending because every horror film has to have one these days. So they got the actors back 6 months later to do a 10-second boo scare before the credits, and it feels so embarrassingly forced. That's a bad note to end on. For something that spent such a long time on the shelf, Open 24 Hours does have some virtues. It has some decent performances, some good direction in spots, and some solid production design. The script, though, is a dog's breakfast, namely because it starts as one thing and it ends as something else, and really it would have benefited from being much more upfront in its intentions. If you want to make a slasher film, just make a slasher movie, because instead it feels like it's overly crowded and overthought. This feels bloated at 100 minutes and just too long. That being said though, if you're a die-hard horror fan, there is definitely things that you'll probably appreciate. You'll certainly enjoy some of the gorier gags here, but I think that it's also a movie that won't take you 24 hours to forget. Open 24 Hours has a promising start, but it soon retreats into standard slasher territory. The film tries to be deliberately ambiguous with whether the terror is all in the protagonist's mind, but all too quickly gives away the answer, mostly using it as an excuse for cheap jump scares to fill out an overly long setup. Director Padraig Reynolds makes good use of his largely single location and doesn't stint on the gore once it arrives, but the vicious sadism and much of it is more unpleasant than enjoyable. Although better than its 2 years on the shelf implies, it is a lot of familiar genre tropes that horror fans will have seen many times before. If you like this review, then fill your tank over at my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks, including access to my Discord server. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.